am Manisha Mishra, the Program Director at Alabama Possible and the facilitator of the webinar today. Welcome to Break It Down, a discussion about barriers to prosperity in Alabama. In today's webinar, our panelists will discuss, let me share the screen, the presentation. The panelists will discuss on how to use this, the data sheet as a teaching tool. You can download the data sheet and discussion guide by visiting alabamapossible.org/datasheet. Housekeeping. The webinar will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel. During the presentation, please submit your questions in the chat or Q&A feature, and I will address them after the presenters finish presenting. You can follow Alabama Possible on social media, Facebook, that is Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We have an exciting group of presenters today. Our first presenter is May Whiting, Data and Research Manager at Alabama Possible. She will give us an overview of the data sheet. Our next presenter is Stephanie Nettles. She is the social studies teacher at Shelby County High School, and she will be sharing with us how she uses the data sheet in her economics and government classes. Laurel Hitchcock is an associate professor of social work at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. She is also on the board of Alabama Possible and will be sharing with us how she uses this data sheet in her classrooms and discuss with us the educator's guide. The presenters will present in the order that they have been introduced, starting with May Whiting.
All right, hello everyone. My name is May Whiting. I'm the Data and Research Manager at Alabama Possible, and I'll be giving you an overview of our data sheet. So this is our 10th year of producing the data sheet. Historically, it has been called the Poverty Data Sheet, which is based in Alabama Possible's organizational history and focus on education around poverty issues. This year, we have renamed it the Barriers to Prosperity Data Sheet, and that's for a few reasons. We know that reducing poverty is not the same as creating prosperity, and we want to convey that being above the federal poverty line does not necessarily translate to economic security or prosperity. And especially when taking into account recent events like COVID-19, we know that even those families far above the poverty line are facing economic insecurity. So by focusing on different kinds of barriers to prosperity, we hope to advocate for a state in which every single Alabamian has economic security and can weather unexpected storms such as the one we're facing right now. So by producing the data sheet every year, we report on numerous and varied barriers to prosperity. We utilize national and state data sets covering food security, employment, and education measures. We also hope to highlight stark disparities, whether that is across race and ethnicity or disparities among different counties within our state. We want to make evident the different kinds of inequalities that do exist in our state. We hope that the data sheet reaches several audiences, from policymakers who are working towards creating and passing more equitable policies to nonprofit organizations that are advocating for investments in their communities, and to educators like yourselves who are teaching their students about the systems and the structures that have created disparities like the ones we'll be covering when we review the data sheet. And then our data sheet allows for comparisons between Alabama and other states in the country, as well as among the various counties within the state of Alabama. We do cover measures for all 67 counties within our state. We compile the data from several national sources that include the US Census Bureau's American Community Survey, as well as the US Department of Agriculture for food security data, and the US Bureau of Labor Statistics for employment data. And we also utilize data sets from state agencies like the Alabama Department of Human Resources for food security data and the Alabama Commission on Higher Education for post-secondary education data. So if we can advance to the next slide. And we'll go back one more. Thank you, yeah. So to summarize some of this year's key findings, this year, Alabama is the 5th poorest state in the country. More than 800,000 Alabamians live below the federal poverty line, and that includes 256,000 of Alabama's children. To give you an idea of how poverty is measured, for a single individual, the federal poverty threshold is $12,784. For a family of 4, the federal poverty threshold is $25,701. Now, it's obvious that this threshold doesn't really give us an accurate depiction of what it takes to support a family of this size. And we know that the threshold does not fully capture the scope of disadvantage and hardship that Alabamians are facing. So our data sheet is to kind of cover all the different barriers that these families face. Now, while poverty in Alabama has decreased over the last 4 years, the state's poverty rate is still much higher than the national average. As you can see on this, can you go back one slide? I'm sorry. Yeah, as you can see on this slide, the national overall poverty rate is 13.1%, while the state overall poverty rate is 16.8%. 10 counties in Alabama have a poverty rate higher than 25%, and 8 of those counties have poverty rates higher than 30%, meaning close to 1/3 or more of the county's residents live below the federal poverty line. Additionally, the child poverty rate in the US is 18%, while the child poverty rate in Alabama is 23.9%. And then another way to look at economic insecurity is to highlight income disparities by looking at median household income. So the national median household income is $61,937, while Alabama's median household income is about $12,000 less at $49,881. So if you can advance to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, one goal of our report is to build awareness around disparities, including those across race and ethnicity. We acknowledge that our state and our country's history of racial injustice, from slavery to Jim Crow laws to mass incarceration. We also acknowledge the ways that our state has been hostile to Hispanic and Latinx immigrants. We can see some of the effects of discriminatory practices and policies on this slide. So here we see the overall poverty rate by race and ethnicity. We note that Black or African American and Hispanic or Latinx Alabamians experience poverty rates far higher than white Alabamians. And then if you'll go to the next slide. Similarly, median household income for those groups are far lower than the median household income for white Alabamians. So it's really important that we recognize the ways that both individuals and institutions have perpetuated racial inequality and the impact that this has had on Alabama residents. So we acknowledge the disparities so that we can advocate for a better, more equitable Alabama. And this is something that we highlight on the data sheet, as well as in our discussion guide that we'll be talking about later. So let's go ahead and review the data sheet. I am going to share my screen so that you can view that. Oops, one moment. All right, can everyone see my screen? Awesome, okay. So starting out page 1 of our data sheet, here you're going to see a couple of maps. And we use maps to visualize and highlight the poverty rates of the 67 counties within Alabama, as well as all 50 states. So the darker the shading of the county or state, the higher the poverty rate. And this allows for quick and easy comparisons to be made. So we then highlight poverty thresholds by family size, and this is as defined by the US Census Bureau. So again, it's important to note the inadequacy of this measure alone, which is why we contextualize it with the data on the second page of the data sheet. Below these thresholds, we highlight the poverty rates and the median household income as disaggregated by race and ethnicity in order to show that disparities exist not only with the United States, which are the light green bars, but also within Alabama, which are the darker blue bars. And then we show trends in these measures by highlighting the changes from 2014 to 2018, which is when the most recent data release was. So you can see these trend lines, poverty rates, and trend lines of median household income. Now moving on to the second page. Here we have data for all 67 counties, as well as the state as a whole and the United States. The measures are broken into categories, starting with poverty rates. So we have poverty rates that are broken up into groups based on race and ethnicity, age, as well as educational attainment. So for instance, in the last column of this section, we see the poverty rate of individuals who are 25 or older and have a bachelor's degree or higher. In the next section, we see rates of food insecurity as measured by Feeding America. And we also see the rates of recipients of SNAP benefits or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. In the next section, we see education measures such as the percentage of the population who's at least 25 and has at least a high school diploma or higher. And then individuals who are at least 25 and have a bachelor's degree or higher. But then we also have the college enrollment rates, including both 2-year and 4-year college going rates. As you can see here, Alabama has a higher rate of enrollment in 2-year institutions, and that means it's so important to have a continued investment in community colleges, as well as an investment in supporting students transitioning from 2-year colleges to 4-year institutions. Lastly, we highlight employment measures, including workforce participation rate of those 16 and older, and then the median household income. Towards the bottom of page 2, we have some key terms and definitions, as well as all the citations for our sources that we've used to compile the data sheet. So that is the general layout of our 2-page data sheet. And now we'll take a look at the data dashboard, which is an interactive version of the data sheet. So let me share my screen one more time. So here's the landing page. Can everyone see this? Okay. Here's the landing page of our Barriers to Prosperity data resources. About midway down, we have a link to our data dashboard that you can click right here. So when you first access the dashboard, you'll be on the first tab, Poverty by State. Here you can click any state on the map, and when you click it, you can see the overall poverty rate, the child poverty rate, and median household income. If you go to the second tab, Poverty by County, you can click any county on the map, and then you can see detailed data on population, poverty rate, food security, education, and employment. If you go to our third and final tab called County Data Table, you can use this to compare all counties or select which counties are of interest to you. So if I deselect all, and then I select a few counties, those will populate on the screen. And then if I'd like, I can sort by any measure at the top. So by clicking the column heading, if I want to click by child poverty rate, I can sort by descending or ascending order. I can do that again to do the opposite way. And that just allows me to look at any counties of interest and make quick comparisons. So the data dashboard will be especially useful for making the data interactive for class assignments. In addition to the dashboard, we have discussion guides, including one specifically created for the classroom, and that will lead educators through discussion questions as well as class assignments. Dr. Hitchcock will discuss that in more depth, but now I will pass it over to Stephanie Nettles, representing K through 12 educators.
Good morning. I wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to be here with Alabama Possible and to share some of the ways that I use the data in my classroom, from the Barriers to Prosperity data sheet. I look forward every year for this information to come in because I use it often in my classes throughout the year. It usually comes in via email and then I get a hard copy later on. But I'm excited about the dashboard and how easy it is to maneuver. In the past, I've had to put, the data sheet under my projector and then project it up onto the screen, and it's hard for my students to manipulate the information without making copies of it for them. So the dashboard really is going to be, I think, a benefit in my classroom because of the ease of using during the next school year. So I teach American Government and Economics to 12th graders at Shelby County High School here in Shelby County on the lower side of the county, economics, advanced placement, government and politics, and as well as a couple of history classes. Depending on if there's an overflow, my principal gives me my history fix, as I call it, because I love history so much, to be able to teach some of those students. So I have used the data in several ways in all of those classes. And being on the south side of Shelby County, and this is not where I was raised in South Alabama in a very small county with very little opportunity. And so a lot of times teaching in Shelby County, our kids tend to, be more privileged, not to use that word in a negative way, but our rates on the data page tend to be, extremely different than some of the other areas of our state. But where I teach in Lower Shelby County, we have a very diverse group. We have families from very affluent, students from very affluent families, and we have students from families that struggle and really see the relevance. Both groups really see the relevance of this data in my classroom the way I present it. So each of the ways I use the data can be adapted. Even though I teach 12th grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade, I really think that the data can be adapted to be able to be used in all grades, K through 12, and just being very creative so that students can see the differences in our state economically. And of course, the education discussion guide that accompanies the data sheet this year really opens up several different ways that you can introduce the material and then create some very thought-provoking discussions with your students, again, at all levels, especially, there's several questions where the students draw inferences from the data, reviewing the data, and then draw those inferences, which is a great social studies skill. It's my belief as an educator that we should be intentional to help our students learn empathy. Of course, not only does this help them see the real relevance of the historical subjects that we're teaching, but with the data sheet, it allows our students to see that 1 in 4 students, fellow students like them, children in Alabama, live below the poverty threshold. That food security and opportunity for so many of their fellow students that do live in areas in our state doesn't give them an equitable chance to attain or achieve goals. That we as educators want to see them set those goals for themselves. In addition, of course, they need to be equipped with this information because they're a younger generation. And we know that this younger generation, through media and through potentially this dashboard, can make a change. And they need to feel that type of efficacy, that they can make the difference by being knowledgeable of the differences in certain areas of our state, can empower them. So I want to go ahead and share a couple of the things that I do in my classroom. And I don't know, Misha, if we could actually put those websites up in the chat, if that would be possible as I go through these. So in government class, first and foremost, I teach the topic of federalism. It's a huge topic that I teach, the relationship between the federal government and the states, in addition to the relationship between the states. So one of the things that we use this data sheet for is to show, along with some other websites that I pull up on my projector and we go through and I print out some of these articles, the federal funding distribution comparison that is established and does exist in the states. So what does Alabama send into the federal government? What does it get back in comparison to like states like New York? How much they send in, what comes back to the states in the form of assistance programs or Pell Grants or contracts, government contracts. How does that happen? So with Wallet Hub, there's an article on Wallet Hub that will potentially be in the chat. And literacy, of course, is a big focus and is a big focus for all of us in K through 12. My students can use the data sheet and then we read this article, and then I challenge them to find other articles of government programs and government ways in which money comes back to us and money in the different areas of our state. There's an older article from 2013 that I like to use, and I know it's older, but it's from governing.com and how the states get federal money and how certain areas of our state through the data sheet need that money, need those aspects of jobs, need that assistance for education for young people. So we chunk that and we use talk to the text and those literacy tools to help them as they're leaving high school to be able to use and disseminate information that they're getting. So in a second thing that I use in my government and economics classes both are safety net programs, and how that through the federalsafetynet.com website and the Alabama Possible data that is provided with the data sheet, that we can see that where the largest numbers of Alabamians are actually in need. When we do this in government, we do it through contracts. We do it through that aspect of federalism. But when we do it in economics in my second semester classes, we coordinate that with placement.org, which is a website that gives the kids a game. And I have a worksheet activity that I do with them where they have to try to live life on with its bumps and surprises with a certain amount of money and see how long they can last. And it really lends itself to us discussing in the classroom these areas of our state where there are more challenges, there are less jobs, there are less opportunities for young people and for families. And I've got that activity attached with the information that could be sent out after the webinar. So another thing I do in my economics class is a correlation between the Alabama Possible data and looking at each of the individual 67 counties in our state, and have the students pick apart the demographics and then the impact of the data that they see. Now, when they do that, we also use the state's labor department website. So the labor.alabama.gov workforce, we go to that and they can use the data sheet, the Barriers to Prosperity data sheet, but then they can go to each individual county and they can see what are the opportunities there. What are the jobs? What are the industries? So that they, and my students start making those connections. They see how that, some counties, there's more industry, there's more colleges, there's more education, they start making those connections. And which really lends itself to sometimes these questions from my students of, how do we change that? How do we ever break that cycle? And I tell them very honestly, your generation can break that cycle. You guys, can put your minds to do anything. You've just got to know that there's the issue there. And of course, education is the key there. In addition to that, the Labor Department, the Alabama Labor Department opportunities can be discussed as well, so that they can see where there's jobs, where there's resources that can be used. And of course, that Alabama Employment Salaries website part of the Labor Department is a good thing for my students. And I coordinate all this with the data sheet. We go back and forth to that data sheet because the new one always comes back in spring. And so we use the old one for the first semester, and then we use the old one until the new one comes in the spring, and then we start using the new data. And they know that, when it comes in, I'm like, I got the new data today. We're gonna look at this for a second, and then we'll go back to our lesson that we're supposed to pick up with today. But anyway, with that, we also do an industry distribution activity where we take the 7 regions of the state of Alabama through the Labor Department and through our data sheet, and we look at the way industry has grown in certain areas and how that industry hasn't grown in other areas. And of course, that's reflective of the effect, the data sheet is reflective of the fact that industry hasn't grown in certain areas of our state, and how that it needs to be more equitable. The last thing I would say is that, I do this with my history classes as well, not just my government, just not my seniors who are fixing to leave us. I do this in history as well when I teach George Washington to 10th graders, and I talk about how that he was, he struggled to be economically successful his entire adult life, and still until he started using his resources on the 5 farms there at Mount Vernon to make whiskey, and when he finally started using his resources that he had, and a lack of needing to transport them, all he had to do is send them 7 miles up the river to Alexandria, and he'd sell out quick. He started using those resources. Well, when we talk about that from his entrepreneurial standards, I then correlate that back to Alabama, and have the students tell me what are the areas where our resources have been used the most. And the data sheet is the effects of that. Jefferson County and Central Alabama using coal and iron ore and lime, equated to the effects of population growth and transportation growth and cities and education facilities. And all of that combined together has led to certain areas of our pockets of our state to be more prosperous than others. So again, touching back on that, the need for my students to know that there are pockets of our state where we need that industry, where we need that education, where we need those opportunities to really, let them know that, 1 out of 4 children aren't hungry in Alabama, that they aren't receiving those assistance programs, that they are being treated more equitably. So those are some of the things that I do in my classroom. And I know that there's a lot of teachers out there that are much more creative than I am and could come up with all kinds of different programs and all kinds of different things that they do in the classroom with this data sheet. I just think this is a wonderful resource to use with my students. And I really do see light bulbs go off with them when we're doing it, when we're using it. So I'm going to turn it over to Laurel. She'll tell us about how she uses data in higher ed.
Thanks, Stephanie. It was really a pleasure to listen to you talk about how you use this with your students in the classroom. And as I think about higher ed, those are things that we could be doing in our history classes and our economic classes. So I hope those of you who are listening who are in higher ed think about using it in that way as well. I want to just mention that I'm a social worker by training, and I teach social work at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And in our profession, one of our professional goals, competencies, is to work with vulnerable populations, specifically around issues of poverty. So it doesn't take much for me to introduce this concept into the classroom. So it's a natural fit for my profession, but I have seen my colleagues across campus use the Prosperity to Data sheet in a variety of ways, and I'll talk about that as well as a couple other things. The Educator's Guide, we've got a link here to the data sheet discussion. And then I will talk through the different assignments and how I use it in the classroom. As well as across campus, I actually use this as an advocacy tool across campus, not just with my own students in social work, but across the board. So let me just sort of start with how I use it in the classroom, and then how I've seen my colleagues across campus use the data sheet. I'm not used to that new title for the data sheet, so it's going to take me a second to get that. I like it, by the way. So, so every year we get copies of the data sheet, just like Stephanie does, or I have a stack from the previous year. And I get those directly from Alabama Possible. They share them with me, and I will incorporate them into 2 of my classes. One is, both of these are practice courses for social work, where we're teaching skills. And we use the data sheet once in one class, connected with the poverty simulations that we do on campus. And this is something that we have started doing as a result of our work with Alabama Possible at UAB. And a poverty simulation is an opportunity. It's a live in-person simulation. And if you participate, you are placed in a family, and you are given enough resources or not enough resources to make it through a month. And you have to interact with other people in the simulation, service providers, the grocery store, whatever, the bank, places like that, to make sure you and your family get through the month. And it's an intensive, in-person, powerful experience for our students. And so when our students go through it, at the end, they often frequently ask, what can we do? How can we change this? And along with offering a couple of suggestions, we hand them the poverty data. We hand them the data sheet. And they can look at the actual data, and they can see it, and they can look at it in relation to where they might be from in Alabama or in the United States. And so that's one really powerful tool, how we share it there. Additionally, I use it all the time in classroom discussion. So it really doesn't matter what class I'm teaching in social work. I hand out the data sheet, and we use the discussion questions, and we might talk about it in relation to the things that Stephanie talked about. So if I'm teaching a policy class, I'm going to talk about how the poverty guidelines were set, the federal guidelines, and what does that mean and how does that look. If I'm teaching a community class, we're going to use the data sheet to assess communities. And I'll delve into that a little bit more. So whatever the class is, we can talk about poverty, and we can use the data sheet. And just like Stephanie talked about, the students begin to make connections between the data, what they're seeing in real life, and then how they can make changes. And specifically in my profession, we start talking about how we can make changes as a professional social worker. I have colleagues in nursing who do the same thing, in medicine as well. And additionally, I have colleagues in the humanities who also bring the data sheet into discussions. I think the most creative one is in the foreign language courses. They bring it in as a way to help students learn that foreign language by discussing something that's very different than, say, how do you say hello in French, or how do you order something in Japanese at a restaurant. They bring the data sheet in as a way to have different types of conversations. And so you're not only learning how to speak another language, but you're also talking about a complex social problem, which is really, I think, important and very a creative way to do that. If you're interested in knowing how to do that in more details, I will be happy to connect you with my colleagues, because I do not teach French or Japanese. So in terms of one of the classes that I teach a communities and organizations class. So we're teaching students how to go out and assess a community. And you'll see the link here to the educator's guide. I actually talk about this assignment and I provide all the details in that educator's guide. So please go and look at that. It's a 7-page guide and it has all discussion questions and it has a community assessment worksheet. And I do this in class as an in-class or an online activity with my students. And what I'm asking, I hand them a copy of the data sheet as well as the worksheet. And I ask them to go through the data sheet and select the county that they're from. If they're not from the state of Alabama, they can pick the county where they're currently living or any county of interest and compare it, and then compare where they're from to where they're living now, perhaps, or make some sort of comparison. Because I teach in Jefferson County, Alabama, I like to focus on that because Jefferson County tends to have a lot more resources than other counties. And it's really important for my students to recognize that. So we look at the different, how poverty across all the indicators looks in Jefferson County versus their home county or different counties. We make comparisons with the United States as well as the state level so my students can really get an understanding of what that looks like. And as they search for all the data in there, they start to make these comparisons. And particularly, I want them to think about where is poverty higher, where is it lower, who has more food stamp applications, or who, you know, which populations, which counties have more of this higher percentages on these indicators or lower percentages. And that gets the students thinking and talking about how communities look different from each other. Additionally, after we do that, one of the things that the students will do is they'll create an infographic. And infographics, if you think about it, the data sheet is itself one large infographic. It's a really concise, easy way to share data. And so what I ask my students to do is to take their home county and compare it to the state of Alabama and do a really simple infographic around that, pulling data from this particular data sheet. And it's a way for them to really begin to think about how this data is and then how they can in turn share what they've learned. So they'll share it with each other. They might share it with, if they're working out in the community, they might share it with a supervisor, with a parent. And additionally, we ask them to share it with any social service providers that they're interacting with. A lot of our students then go on to do a practicum placement, and we ask them to present and share that data there. Because using this data sheet is a great way to communicate about poverty in the social service agencies that we work with. And so we ask our students to do that. So each one of these assignments are outlined in the educator's guide that you can go ahead and take a look at. And of course, if you've got questions about it, you are welcome to reach out to anybody at Alabama Possible or myself around that. But we provide detailed directions on how to do that in the educator's guide. Another thing that I do with the data sheet is I make sure everybody in my department, every faculty member, every adjunct faculty member, and every staff member has a copy of the data sheet. It gets posted on our campus. As a matter of fact, I have a colleague who, like very similar to what you do, Stephanie, when the data comes out in spring, she's knocking on my door saying, where's my copy of the data sheet? And she puts it up on her door. We have this posted in our department. And I also share it with my colleagues across campus, those who I know who are interested in the topic. And frequently they will ask for additional copies. They will share it with their classes, their colleagues as well. And so we can think about it as a way to do some very passive, not always active education, but passive education. By posting it on the door of my office, every student who walks through that door knows that this is an important issue for me and for the department and for the profession of social work. And so there are ways that we can use that as well. Finally, there is a new discussion guide that has come out with the data sheet. And so if one of you received a copy of the paper data sheet, you would have also gotten a copy of this discussion guide. And this discussion guide is designed, it can be easily used in the classroom, but it also can be used in other places. So think about all those different places that you might have discussions about poverty not related to work. I think about my book group, for example, or maybe you're part of a Sunday school classroom, or maybe this is something that you talk about at your mosque or your synagogue, and you can use the discussion guide to create a discussion forum for your own personal groups. I use these questions with my family at times. They really enjoy that. But again, with my book group, I hand out the poverty data sheet to my book group, and we talk about some of the questions from the discussion guide. So as we think about being educators, we can use this in a variety of ways. The other thing that I think is really important to do is to share these resources with other colleagues. So I'm not just sharing them with my folks on campus, I'm sharing them with all social work educators in Alabama and beyond. So think about all those professional groups that you might work with, and share out these resources as well with them. So they can get copies of the data sheet if they want to from Alabama Possible. The new dashboard and the digital versions make it very easy to share with other folks. So think about those types of sharing and resources as well. Let's see, I think that's about all I have to say about the Educator's Guide and how I use it. So Manisha, I'm going to turn it back over to you for questions.
Thank you. Thank you, May, for giving us an overview of the data sheet. And thank you, Laurel and Stephanie, for showing us how, how educators in higher education, as well as K through 12, can use it in their classrooms. Now, since Laurel mentioned about the physical copy, this is what it looks like. I wanted to show everybody. This is what the data sheet looks like. And it is very comprehensive and very easy to use. This is a great tool for you to be able to use it, not only in your classrooms, but in your communities too. And I'm going to check now if we have any questions. Okay, so there is one question over here. Because of COVID-19, is there a plan to make the simulation virtual? That is for Laurel.
I can take this one. I did mention the poverty simulation. Of course, that's not the purpose of this particular webinar, but the poverty simulation and the data sheet go hand in hand really well. So what we know about the poverty simulation is that the folks at the Missouri Community Action Network, MCAN, are not recommending that we hold the poverty simulations in person until the COVID pandemic has been, it's more manageable. It is just not physically possible to distance everybody in a simulation. Well, you can try to distance, you can try to wear masks, not try, you can wear masks during this. There are too many different pieces and props that that are required to be passed between individuals, and it's just extremely hard to social distance. So the Missouri Community Action Network is not recommending that. There is an option of an online virtual simulation that is created by the, oh my gosh, I hope I get this right. It is it is called SPENT. I'm going to put it in the chat. It's the Durham. Thank you, Christina, for putting that in there. I'm blanking on the name of the group that creates it, but it's while it's not. This is something that folks would do individually. So if you had students who wanted to do this, they would do it individually. This is what we're using at UAB this fall. We are not running. Thank you, Christina, the Urban Ministries of Durham in North Carolina. Thank you for that. We are not doing in-person simulations simulations. We're using SPENT, so we're doing some pre-work with our students. We're having them do SPENT, and then we're doing follow-up virtual conversations. So if you're looking for that option, I would highly recommend that.
Thank you. Thank you, Laurel. I don't see any other questions right now, so we will move on to the concluding part of the presentation. So again, we had, as we had mentioned earlier, if you want to download the data sheet and the discussion guide, you can go on alabamapossible.org/data sheet. And you can download it. It's easier. The digital version is also very easy to use. If you have any questions, please reach out to us at Alabama Possible, and we will help you if we will assist you in the process. And thank you again to everybody for attending this webinar. And we hope that you're going to use this data sheet in your work. Thank you.